Hey everyone, I'm Steve. This is the American Garage.
On this episode of the American Garage, Steve continues on to the next step of the David Bradley Restoration Project, focusing on rust removal. All of this and more on this episode of the American Garage.
Last time on the American Garage, we did the teardown process and organizing ourselves for the David Bradley Garden Tractor project. As you remember, we had to keep ourselves organized. We put all the parts and the small parts into baggies so we wouldn't lose them, and we categorized everything. This week on the American Garage, now that we have everything disassembled, we're going to go through the process of making everything ready for repainting. So today is going to be about rust removal. Now, there are several different processes for removing rust that we could use, but we're going to explore three different kinds today. We're going to explore first sanding, which is probably what most people are going to be able to do, using regular sandpaper. Now this is 220 grit, as we said. With metal, we don't want to have too coarse of a sandpaper because it will scratch up the metal too much. Also, when working with metal, we can use wire brushes, wire wheels. This is a good tool. And then, of course, we can jump over to sanders using a power sander when hand sanding isn't enough. And we have different grits of sandpaper for the sander as well. In addition to that, we're also going to use a bench grinder with a wire wheel installed. A bench grinder has usually a stone on one side and a wire wheel on the other. Now, the one thing that you need to keep in mind when you're using a power wire wheel is, one, don't forget to wear your safety glasses. The wheels tend to throw the little wires, and you don't want to get one of those stuck in your eye. So we'll make sure we're using our safety glasses. The other thing is, whenever you're using a wire wheel or a grinder with a wire brush on it, you want to make sure that you don't press too hard. Because what happens is, and this wire wheel is actually a good example because this one has failed. Now this wire wheel has failed because it was pressed down too hard. And when it presses down too hard, they break off quickly and easily. The wire brush, the wire wheel, really cannot do its job if you push too hard. And it's tempting to do that because there's a lot of rust and you want to remove it as fast as you can, especially with the machine. But if you push too hard, it's just going to destroy the wire brush. When we are using our sandpaper, of course, we can use it manually with our hands, or we can use the power tools. Now, the power sander is going to make it go much easier and quicker, but you are going to go through a lot of sandpaper. It's good to buy the sanding discs in large quantities, usually a box of them. Okay. Now, while we're working with the bench grinder for the wire wheel, we need something to be able to hold the item that we're working with, and this is really only going to be for small pieces. We can't really hold big pieces up here and get them in to the wire wheel, so we just use it for small pieces. It's ideal for things like nuts and bolts. A lot of times when you get a basket project, you pick up a project from somebody else and they're going to give you a box full of nuts and bolts like this. And they're going to look something like this. Now that doesn't look very good, does it? They're all rusty and gnarly and covered with oil and grease and whatever. But what we're going to do is we put this into the wire wheel and it's going to look like new again. Now some people may think, oh, well, let's just go get new nuts and bolts because these look terrible. But these are made of high tension steel that you can't just go down to the hardware store and buy. So you want to use these over wherever you can. process we're going to use on what parts. And here I've got the engine cover for the engine on the David Bradley. This is an old Briggs & Stratton engine. I've got a little BS on there. And it's mostly rusted, but it's not heavily rusted. So I think this is a good candidate for hand sanding. It's got an unusual shape to it. You see all these little grooves here? That is not going to make for a very good candidate for using the palm sander or the electric sander. So this will have to be sanded by hand. Let's give it a try. I'm going to take just one little piece of my 220 grit, and I'm going to start up here. And as you can see, we're starting to make some progress. However, you can tell that it's going to take a long time. So let's try this same thing, and let's use the palm sander, but let's stay out of the grooved areas, and let's try to hit the big areas with the palm sander. So here we're going to use the palm sander on these large areas here. Alright, would you have a look at this real quick? Now, you can see how the metal is mostly shiny, but we have lots of little dots of discoloration. Do you see that? Now, those dots of discoloration are little bits of rust that have gotten in there. Now, to do this properly, what we need to do is sand until those are gone, so that it's all shiny and even colored on the metal. However, that's going to take quite a while to do with the sander. Okay, so I'm going to work on this for a while. Okay. Now, as you can see, this is a very slow process, and I'm not really satisfied with the results of how it's coming out. So I think that this piece is a good candidate for another process that we want to cover called sandblasting. Sanding with sandpaper is a good process if you have little or no rust. But once you have rust in the situation, then it's going to make it very difficult for us to clean this up in any kind of timely fashion and be able to actually get into all those deep little pits in there. So why don't we just set this one aside and save it as a candidate for getting sandblasted. The next part that I want to show you is this is the pulley that runs the tractor, and it also runs the accessories. So on one of these grooves runs the pulley for the tractor itself, and the other one runs whatever accessories we want attached to the tractor. We get a lawnmower or a sickle cutter or any kind of device that they have that needs some kind of power to it. But this piece of metal is very hard. It's hardened steel. And as a result, it does have some rust, but it's surface rust. Unlike this, which is just stamped steel, this hardened steel is a lot less susceptible to rusting. Now you may look at it and say it's got a lot of rust on it, but watch what happens. I'm just going to take a regular plain old wire brush. Watch what's going to happen on this top here. And do you notice a difference on that already? Alright, now this side we haven't touched, this side we have. Let me go ahead and do the other side real quick. Now, you can see how that looks pretty good, doesn't it? And we could go just a little bit further and we could put some primer and some paint on there and it'd be fine. However, we don't get the brightness from the metal that we saw over here. And we want to try to get the metal as bright as we can. So let's try this as a good candidate for our wire wheel. Now remember, anytime you use your power tools, make sure you read the instructions that go with your power tools and follow all the safety guidelines. And there's no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now since this is a heavy metal piece, I can probably just hold it with my hands, but I don't want to get my bare hands up against this wire brush when it's moving. So I'm going to put on some heavy leather gloves so that I can use it to hold on to. You can see the part that we did already, as opposed to the other end. But let's just do half of it with the wire wheel and see what happens. Now, can you see what a big difference that makes? You see the difference between the wire brush and the wire wheel? That's going to be ready for paint right now. We could put some primer on there and be just fine. So I think that this is an excellent candidate for the wire wheel. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this one up. Now, notice that I'm also sitting off to the side. Now, whenever you're using a wire wheel or any kind of grinding device like this, there's going to be a guard on most of them. This one has a guard on the side. And what you want to make sure that you do is that you tip the piece away from the wheel and only let the bottom side hit the wheel. Because if you were to let the top catch, it would grab it out of your hands. So what you want to make sure that you do is carefully hold it so that it's tipped away, and that way the machine will not grab it away from your hands. Now here we are with the piece all done, except as you can see there's still rust inside the grooves. Now the grooves will not go onto my wire wheel, so I'm going to have to resort to using my standard manual brush to finish it off. Now I'm discovering that my wire brush is a little too big to get in there as well. So that's giving me problems as well. This is why we have different processes, because some things won't work in some places. So what we're going to do at this point, we could do one of two things. We need a smaller wire brush, or we could use some sandpaper and get in there with our finger. Alright, so my big wire brush is too big. So let's try this little one. And you can probably tell that the inside the grooves is not as good as the outside from the wire wheel, but it's going to be just fine. Now this piece is ready for paint. Let's go ahead and put some paint on it right away so that we don't have to worry about it rusting up again. So what we'll do is we'll just put primer for now, because we're not ready to put the final coats of paint on things yet. Sandblasting is a process that we can use to remove rust from metal. It's different from using sandpaper because you can get into the deep areas and the little pits and the crevices that we couldn't get into on the engine cover. So we're going to use sandblasting to get that rust off of the piece. Sandblasting involves spraying sand at a very high pressure onto the piece of metal and removing the rust in that way. It's much more effective when we have an uneven surface or when we have little pitted areas like we had on the engine cover. Alright, now I want to show you a typical sandblasting gun. Okay? Now as you can see here, we have a gun. We have a hose here. On this hose, this is where the sand comes in. And this hose is where the high pressure air comes in. This is the one that's used inside the sandblasting booth. And I just pulled it out here so you could see what it looks like. So it looks like a gun. Okay, so let's get ready to do some sandblasting. Now this sandblasting booth is going to protect my lungs because there's going to be a lot of dust flying, and also protect my face and my eyes from the flying sand.
Next time on The American Garage, Steve works on repairing metal on the David Bradley with a little help from professional welder Kino Gonzalez. All of this and more to come on The American Garage.